thank you to Jonathan Higgins for joining us tonight. He's going to be presenting on scanning and railroads and such. I'm pretty excited to see this presentation. Thanks, Chesney, for getting it arranged. And with that, we'll turn it over to Jonathan.
Well, good evening, everybody. So tonight we're going to talk about rail fanning scanning 101. This is actually a class that I put together for the Cincinnati Railroad Club. They meet the first Thursday of every month at the Cincinnati Union Terminal, otherwise known as the Museum Center. So I'm actually a member of their club, and then I was able to put together this slide presentation for them, and I've actually taught this twice. So we'll go to the next slide. So a little bit more about me. I've been a rail fan for about 30 years. I've lived in Massachusetts, North Carolina, and now Ohio. I'm also an N-scale modeler, avid railroad photographer, scanner expert. I've worked at Scanner Master full-time since for about over a decade. And then I ended up leaving there, and then still as a contracted worker for them, so I do put in some hours still there, but I worked over at Scanner Master, which is based out of Massachusetts, for over a decade. In 2013, I started the Train Aficionado blog. So that's basically my rail fanning website. And then I ended up starting to host and produce 2 YouTube shows. In 2019, the Scanner Guys. And then in 2020, I started Train Aficionado. So the shows air on Wednesday nights on YouTube. So the first and third Wednesday of every month is the Train Aficionado live show, where I basically cover everything rail fanning. And then on the second and fourth Wednesday of every night, I'm on the Scanner Guys show. So basically I host that, and that's everything scanning. Doesn't necessarily have to be railroad stuff. It's everything to do with scanning, from trunking to analog conventional stuff, digital, covering a facet of a whole bunch of different things, talking about new radios that are coming out, scanners. I'm also a beta tester for Unity. So in the slide deck, I actually have 2 radios that are going to be released sometime, hopefully at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year, that I was beta testing for 2 years. So I was sitting on those, and of course they swear us to secrecy. In order for you to be a beta tester of Unity, you have to be asked. Apparently it's like an elite group that you get brought into. So going a little bit more of the railroad stuff. So I grew up in Middleborough, Massachusetts, and I spent many Sundays watching trains with my dad, building a train, seeing them head off to different locations throughout the Northeast. During the summer, my dad and I would try to get photos of the Amtrak's Cape Codder, which no longer runs anymore. But it basically was coming out of New York City, coming up through Connecticut, and then going down to Hyannis, Massachusetts. So it was a weekend event train that the Amtrak used to run. And it was really cool to be able to get it. And here's one of the photos here of the Amtrak Cape Codder. And of course, I was taking that with film back in the day rather than digital photography. Trust me, I love digital photography. There's no more developing and spending all that money. And of course, I was able to get back in the day, not dating myself, back when Conrail was around. So I've been doing this for a while. We'll go to the next slide. So of course, I am my social media as well. So if you're interested in learning more, you can follow, like, and subscribe to Train Aficionado. I'm on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. And then if you're interested in the Scanner Guys, same thing, Scanner Guys across all social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the next one. All right, here's what we're covering tonight. We're going to talk about the communication, understanding it. A lot of you guys are probably going to understand it, but I'll probably go through this relatively quickly through the communication. Then finding and searching and understanding the channels, what scanners are good for rail fanning, and then your questions. All right, so we'll cover the communication, understanding communication. So what we have on the slide here is typically what a what a railroad worker would use is more like an ICOM or Motorola type of radio. And then the cab radio is fairly large, as you can see there. You're able to select the channel that you're monitoring. Basically on that cab radio, typically the old radios had 97 channels. You would just, tap in one of those channels and be able to, transmit on there. So there is actually set channels for the railroads. So every cab of any locomotive that you go in, typically it's going to be a unit like that, and you just switch to the road channel that you're on and basically communicate to that dispatcher. So the great thing about it, it's all standardized. So basically you could run a Norfolk Southern locomotive as a lead locomotive somehow on the West Coast. Radio set the same way, go to channel 22. Let's say that's the road channel for that particular line that they're running on, and basically communicating to that dispatcher. You're going to see a lot of now foreign power, what we call foreign power. So I don't remember how long ago it was, but it was basically precision scheduling. The railroads created what's called precision scheduling, where they're kind of doing longer runs. So way back when, it used to go from yard to yard. So the railroads figured they would make more money by running direct routes to where the stuff needs to go versus going from one yard to another, sorting the train, and then sending it off to another train. With precision scheduling, they're basically doing a direct route. So a lot of times, the power sometimes gets left on there. You may see a Norfolk Southern locomotive way out in California, which that's not even part of the road. So that's why, where it's handy with the radio communication, especially with the cab radio, it's able to go on any channel that's a railroad channel. We'll go to the next slide. So many of you probably know line of sight. This is not any mystery. So the railroads typically are line of sight. So for instance, the dispatcher will transmit off of one of the towers that are along the railroad line. And then of course it'll receive off, any radios that are there. So for instance, you're a Railfan, you're out trackside. So scanner number 1 is basically the dispatcher. So of course, transmitting off of something nice and high, the signal is going to go a lot further. The locomotive in the cab, that's at ground level, just above the locomotive. That's not going to go as far. So for instance, if you're Railfanning and you're at scanner number 1, you're probably going to hear the dispatcher. As the train gets closer, scanner number 2, you're closer to the train. You're able to hear that and the crew when they're communicating to the dispatcher. So you're able to hear it, depending on how close you are. So in some cases, as many of you know, terrain has a lot of effect, and all that. So, you'll be able to hear it further. So there's not really a science to it. It's just depending on your location and their location. So of course, this is this slide. Can you hear me now? Of course, terrain like this, as you know, if you're down in the valley, it's going to create an issue. All right, so what type of range can I get on my scanner? Of course, many of you know this. It's depending on tons of factors, location, elevation, type of system, your antenna, their antenna, weather, atmospheric conditions, and obstructions. So all these are real basic things. So because it's line of sight, all these things are going to play a role. For the most part, railroads don't use repeaters. They're using line of sight communication. Sometimes, the Amtrak police, if you're up in the Northeast corridor, they use repeaters for their system. Typically, for the most part, it's not going to be a repeaterized thing.
Quick question.
Sure.
Does that imply that there's a dispatcher every 20 miles, something like that? How does that work out?
Very good question. So for around here, Norfolk Southern and CSX rule the roost. Now it's all directed through the internet essentially. So Norfolk Southern is based out of Atlanta, Georgia. It's a big dispatch room. A whole bunch of dispatchers in the room. They're all communicating to trains all over the country. They'll get assigned a desk, and then they'll be assigned a route. So essentially, what'll happen is that one dispatcher may be communicating to train crews here in Cincinnati, and they can be also assigned to a secondary desk where they're communicating to trains in Charlotte. So the cool thing about it is if you travel a lot within a certain railroad territory, you may recognize the dispatcher voice. You know, say, I recognize that dispatcher. I hear her all the time in Cincinnati. And you go somewhere else, you may hear that same familiar voice because they're covering multiple desks. So for the most part, back in the day, they used to be local dispatchers, but of course, you know, everything, you know, they're trying to figure out the best way to essentially save a buck. So they have quote unquote regional dispatching, but railroad style, where they're dispatching out of one room. Typically a yard will have somebody that's locally there communicating to trains coming in and out, kind of playing traffic cop over the radio. But for the most part, once it gets on the main road, it's going to be communicating to a dispatcher. Typically on the radio, there'll be a keypad, and what they're able to do, yeah, you can go back one more. Yeah, so right there, you can see a keypad. So what they could do is they could actually dial up the dispatcher. They could press a certain number and then that'll communicate to one of the receive sites. And then the dispatcher will get a notification that somebody's calling. So a lot of times if they're not monitoring the frequency all the time, you know, they may wait for that alert and then you'll hear it over the radio. And then basically the dispatcher will come on, yeah, go ahead, you know, Cincinnati, you know, whatever they say, typically say over the radio, depending on the road, you'll hear them calling out and then the train will eventually answer. But yeah, Jacksonville, Florida is CSX and Norfolk Southern is Atlanta, Georgia. And then probably in other places, you know, for other railroads, you know, they have centralized dispatch.
Is Amtrak Philadelphia?
Amtrak, I believe they have a dispatch center in Boston, and then it depends on the road essentially. So for most part, Amtrak, Northeast Corridor, they handle all the dispatching. As for anywhere else in the country, they're a guest. So however way, you know, they're using for communication, they're going to be a guest on the railroad. So if they're on Norfolk Southern, CSX, UP, they're communicating to that particular dispatcher.
Yeah, I think about 90% of Amtrak's routes is freight railroads. So
yes, very much so. Basically, the only place that Amtrak rules the roost and get put priority is on the Northeast Corridor. So they will delay, you know, MBTA, they will delay Metro North. That's the only place that Amtrak rules the roost. Anywhere else, you know, if they're on CSX, Norfolk Southern, they have no problem delaying. They do, I think there is some legislation in place that they do delay it for an extended period of time, they do get penalized. But sometimes, you know, probably the big railroads, they don't care, they'll pay the fine. But for the most part, you'll notice that if you monitor anything on the Northeast Corridor, they will basically hold an MBTA. When I was in Massachusetts, they would hold an MBTA train station to get the Acela rolling past them. So they'll be able to speed up ahead. We'll go ahead a couple of slides.
So is it set up like a cellular network where there's towers that are receive sites that are then networked in so that the train, when they're in the middle of, you know, between Dayton and Lima and they need to call in and they have their radio in the cab.
Yeah.
And they go to call a dispatch, their radio signal is going out and hitting a tower somewhere.
Yeah.
And is that then being somehow sent down to Atlanta or Jacksonville via
Phone line,
Phone line,
internet, or, you know, depending on the railroad, they probably all have their different method.
Okay,
CSX will run a lot of their stuff through satellite.
oh,
So they run, for instance, CSX will run their signaling system through satellite. So Norfolk Southern and other railroads, they actually have additional transmitters, which are on the 800 megahertz. And you can actually read the track movements, and that can be translated. I can't remember what that's called off the top of my head. But basically you can see a dispatcher screen. You know, there's a club that I belong to. I can't think of what it is, but basically people put up receive sites and you're able to see, you know, almost like they're able to simulate what the dispatcher sees, which is really cool. But yeah, most of it is going to be telephone line or internet or however they're doing it through fiber. So basically it's going out to that dispatcher, and they're able to see what's going on. Go ahead.
I was thinking if they could see what the dispatcher sees, wouldn't that make, run the risk of making vandalism easy, sabotage easier to do?
Well, they make you jump through hoops to become a part of this group of people. So in order for me to be able to become a part of it, I had to join their, back in the day, it was a Yahoo group. So I had to go through that. And then there's, the website is Train Mod 5, which you can be able to view it online. I'm not too sure. We'll have to pull that up after. We can show what it looks like. But Train Mod 5 is an online base, which I can pull up on my smartphone. And I could see the trains, running. But the thing is, it's, they say it's not real time, but I've heard on the scanner when they say, a line, line track 1 to, the S line. So I'm sitting there on my phone, of course, it's updating in real time. So I get the dispatcher on there. Next thing I can do, I see a green path. So basically, when you're looking at a dispatch screen, it's going to show a line. It's going to show the railroad line, and then the dispatcher is actually going to align it. So it'll show green where the pathway of the train is going to go, and then it'll show red where the train is present on the track. So thankfully, nobody's used it for, I don't know.
For nefarious purposes.
Yes, there's not wood right here, but knocking on wood, so hopefully it never goes away. But no, as far as I know, you really have, it's an elite type of group and you have to kind of know about. So another thing that you can monitor on the scanner, which there's tons of these over here, these defect detectors. So you see these little huts, typically by the tracks, the little building, typically has signaling systems in there. And sometimes it'll have a two-way radio and it'll have defect detectors. So this is actually located in Landis, North Carolina. This is a Norfolk Southern Main line. You can see various sensors here and here. These flaps will actually check for dragging equipment. This here will typically, if I remember correctly, for Hot Wheels. So let's say there's a wheel that's actually flat. What it'll do is it'll drag and it'll make the wheel hot, and then could eventually cause a derailment. So they have these detectors typically every 20 to 30 miles. So what ends up happening, a train will go over this. And then once it's cleared here, you'll hear either computerized voice or an actual recording of somebody saying, CSX detector, milepost 1, 2, 3, 4, no defects, total axle. That's actually wrong because there's never an odd number. I made a mistake there. So it's 622 axles, track 1, temperature 63, detector out. So this will tell the crew that there's no issue with the train whatsoever. If there's an issue with the train, that recording or computerized voice would then indicate an issue. When you're a rail fan, these things are helpful because you're listening on the scanner. If you hear the detector going off, you know that there's something coming, especially if you're in an area where there's no real communication on the radio. So basically the crew is just traveling down the line, no issues. They're not going to communicate to the dispatcher unless they get something going on. Here in Cincinnati, because we have so many rail lines, this is a hotbed of communication. Because everybody's coming into, the couple of yards that are over here, especially the yard behind Cincinnati Union Terminal. They're coming in there. They're either, stopping there, switching crews. There's tons of communication, all hours of the night. There's times that I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, turned the scanner on, the dispatcher's communicating to trains. They're trying to coordinate everything. So it's a hotbed of communication. So you're going to hear a lot. It's quite interesting that, being able to hear the communication. There was one night that Allie and I, this is my girlfriend, were out and we were sitting in Hamilton. That's a great place to rail fan, right by Butler Street, by the McDonald's, with the parking lots right in downtown. So we were sitting there and there was a train that went into emergency. We heard that one night. And then we said, and then we knew where the location was, and it was starting to get dark. So we ended up heading over down the road to be able to see if we could see it. So he had actually a broken air hose. So he went into, he basically went over the radio. He got an indication in the cab that there was an issue with the train. And he went in, he said, emergency, emergency, emergency. Dispatcher comes over the radio. And then communicates to them, and then, of course, there was another train coming, so they then direct that train, approach at restricted speed. The other train then passed the train to see if, half the train was on the ground, because typically when that air hose happens, it's either a broken air hose or a derailment. So luckily it wasn't a derailment, it's just a broken air hose. So just being able to hear those emergencies on the radio. But a lot of times, these things here, these defect detectors are usually a tool to be able to, one, let the crew know what's going on, whether it's a hot wheel, dragging equipment. If there's tunnels, they're gonna have detectors with actual things to be able to see if the cars are too high. Rather than, approaching a tunnel and then hitting the roof of the tunnel. Wide loads, maybe it's going through a narrow tunnel. Or even a shifted load, sometimes maybe a car will, the shifted load will happen, that can cause a derailment. And of course, a hot box issue, it's like a wheel that's getting too hot for whatever reason. We'll go to the next slide. So the other question that I get asked a lot is, are the railroads going digital? They will eventually. Right now, basically, vast majority of the railroads are using analog, conventional. There are some yards using NXDN digital. There's some short lines using it. There's some of the various police departments that are, Amtrak police, which is still analog. There's some, railroad police that are using digital. For the vast majority right now, they're all analog. The reason being, now remember, a lot of railroads are guests on other people's lines. For instance, Amtrak. Amtrak's riding on other railroads. So they need to have radios that are capable of monitoring the dispatcher, the road channel, and so forth. So if, Norfolk Southern decide, no, we're just going to go digital. And they don't, the thing is they need, any guest needs to be able to have, one, a radio that's capable of monitoring it. And two, you just can't do that because you have other people using the same channel. So what's going to happen eventually is all the class ones, Norfolk Southern, CSX, and all the rest of them are going to have to make it a coordinated effort. So what they're probably doing when they replace radios, as you guys know, you can get a brand new rig and it's, you could buy a digital radio, it's still capable of doing analog. So eventually what's going to happen, once all the railroads are invested in new radios, they'll eventually coordinate and say, all right, on such and such day, we're going to switch over to digital. So now, rather than transmitting on channel 22, we're going to be on 122, whatever channel for that particular road. And of course, they're going to have to change all the receive sites. They're going to have to change all the transmit sites. And of course, anything they need to do down in Atlanta, or in our case, for over here, Atlanta or Jacksonville. So the switchover is going to happen eventually. I don't know when. Basically, they've been trying to, the federal government wanted them to switch over to a different signaling system, so they all had to fill that requirement. So they had to spend a boatload of money on that. So the switchover is not a priority, but I think eventually it will be.
So right now it's analog as an FM.
Analog narrow. So they did go to narrow, which was interesting. They did do that. I believe there's probably some that are probably running. But for the most part, it's analog narrow. And, as for the equipment, I'm guessing what they're doing as they're upgrading equipment, they're giving them digital capable radios. I mean, that would make sense. But yeah, I mean, typically the base unit that we see here, pretty simple to operate. A lot of times the conductor's portable is programmed for the handful of channels that they're working off of. So typically, they're not going to have all 97 railroad channels on it unless they have a radio that's, that has it. But yeah, I mean, the rigs are pretty simple. We'll go to the next one. So what can you hear on the scanner typically when you monitor the railroads? So those defect detectors. So that's a major thing. What you also hear sometimes is engineer callouts as they're approaching, and one of the biggest ones up in Hamilton where the depot used to be, and where they moved it up the street. That's one of the callouts that you hear a lot of the crews say, approaching Hamilton Depot, and they'll rattle off real fast, the train symbol, which is their train number. And then they'll say, approaching Hamilton Depot, X15, heading northbound on 1, and they'll rattle it off pretty fast. So that's an engineer call up. That's helpful when you're rail fanning track side. That allows you to say, oh, I got one coming from that direction, at Hamilton Depot. So then I can that gives me kind of a heads up. Of course, work crews to train crews, and then of course, dispatcher to train crews. And of course, if you're out by Cincinnati Union Terminal, there's a whole mess of frequencies that the yard's using. So if you're over there by the Cincinnati Union Terminal, or otherwise known as the Museum Center, there's several yard frequencies and switch operations. Typically for the Cincinnati Railroad Club, we do have the ability to rent Tower A. That used to be the actual tower that's in the building, and you're able to see the whole, a good portion of the yard. So that's really cool, and that's basically they open the tower for members only. So if go ahead.
Well, that tower, it used to be a museum. Is it still a museum now?
So what they've done is, I'm not too sure the backstory. I've been with the club for 2 years. So originally they had the space rented. Now, kind of giving you a little bit of the gossip of the other club. So they had the space rented. For whatever reason, they had they basically moved out of the Cincinnati Union Terminal. They had their club meeting somewhere else, and then they made their way back in to the club. And then basically they weren't able to rent Tower A, so they actually had Tower A, and it was a museum, like you said. They kind of made it into that space. So the museum center was probably asking for too much money, so they ended up renting a space that's on the 3rd floor.
That's not because getting up in that tower isn't exactly the easiest thing. It's not handicap accessible. Why would they charge a lot for it?
I don't know. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it's not handicap accessible. Our space, which is on the 3rd floor, is, and they have no plans to make it handicap accessible to Tower A.
To get up in the tower, you go up an elevator, and then there's like a ladder type thing. It's not exactly stairs, if I remember correctly.
No, there is stairs, so you're able to go upstairs to Tower A.
By the way, I want to comment about what you can hear. I rode the Cardinal multiple times and also other Amtrak trains. You can also listen not only to the defect detectors, but also the engineer will call out to the conductor, the signal aspects and other information along the line.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's a different experience when you're riding on Amtrak because you're basically right there. For the most part, when you're rail fanning, you're only hearing a glimpse of what the communication is. But when you're riding on a passenger train, you're able to hear that engineer to crew communication because you're on board the train. So you're going to be able to hear that communication all the time. When you're standing trackside, you're not going to be able to hear that communication all the time unless it's occurring when it's passing. We'll go to the next slide. So Fred's, so there's basically at the rear of the train, there's this device that basically communicates to the front of the train. This thing transmits to the front. If you program either one of these frequencies in a scanner, it beeps. So if you're on one of these lines where there's hardly no communication whatsoever, you program in either the head end or the rear end train frequency from Fred, you'll start to hear beeping on your scanner and you'll be like, oh, train's somewhere near me. I don't recommend programming this in when you're by a yard. Because there'll be a whole bunch of Freds talking they'd be transmitting at once. So you don't want to do that. Basically, it's transmitting data bursts, and you'll be able to hear a train within the vicinity, which is nice. So being able to, if you're on a line, let's say if you're way north of Cincinnati, it's in the farm section of the state, you get those programmed in there, you start hearing the beeping, all right, there's something coming in one of the directions. So yeah, this is definitely cool to program into your scanner, these two frequencies.
So question.
Yes.
You say data burst, is it like a transponder speed and location?
Just beeping. So it's sending data, which, all we're hearing on the radio is just beeping essentially. Okay. But I'm sure it's basically, I never worked with a railroad, but what I understand, it's connected up to the brake system and connect it up, of course, to everything else. So it's making sure this is communicating to the front of the train to make sure that there's the air hose hasn't, came apart. Like if this, for whatever reason, the train becomes unattached, this thing is going to indicate, well, hey, you left my rear end back here. So essentially, that's going to be an issue. And that's usually when the engineer is going to go, oh crap, we could be derailed. So this is definitely fun to listen to. Well, not fun to listen to, but it's handy to listen to. Next one. Mileposts. So many of you guys, travel on the highway, you see mileposts. A lot of states basically now, they've made the exits, the mileposts. Railroads, same thing. Mileposts are big things there. So you can see here, this is in Kannapolis, North Carolina. This is milepost 347. Typically, this is a number indicating from in between one big city to another. So basically, it's 349 miles to wherever. So these mileposts are used on the radio all the time. So getting to know the railroad that you're rail fanning helps. Now, there's actually online, there are PDFs that you can download, which are timetables. So if you're rail fanning up here, you figure out the lines that you're rail fanning, you can download a timetable. So these timetables are actually employee given. So some employee basically scanned it up and uploaded it to the internet. So now us rail fans can look at their timetable and figure out what milepost is Hamilton Depot, or what milepost is Wyoming, what's the milepost standing. So when you're listening to the radio, you'll hear those call outs and they'll probably say a milepost, or the track detector, of course, when it does that recorded voice, is going to say a milepost. The other thing too, when the dispatcher is communicating to a train, look, you got a work crew at milepost 325, so you're gonna have a speed restriction in between here and this milepost. So mileposts are very handy to knowing where you are. So it's just like mile markers on a highway. So the great thing when you're out rail fanning or watching trains, you'll hear those as well. And then once the bug gets you, then you're going to be like, oh, can I look at the timetable and be able to figure out where I'm at? And then at that point, if you know exactly what milepost you're on and you hear a train communicating at this direction and this direction, you know which direction they're coming at. So very handy. So the scanners. So you don't need, right now, because they're not operating on NXDN for the most part, you don't need a high-end expensive scanner. Of course, I'm not too sure many of you know the SDS 100 and 200 made by Unit. Big price tags. You're looking at about $650 for the handheld, about $700 for the base one. So they're very expensive. Of course, it'll do NXDN, but you need to pay for the upgrade. So right now, if you're monitoring analog conventional, 125 AT is the go-to for rail fans. It's $130. It's not very expensive. Of course, many of you on your handheld rigs, you're able to program in railroad frequencies. So really, you can use the same unit. But if you want
They're
something,
just, that number's right above our VHF allocation.
yeah, it's 160, 161.
Yeah, so our antennas can pick this stuff up.
Oh, yeah, you don't need anything special.
Yeah, you don't need anything special, but this radio is probably one of the best ones. It's $130. You'll see a lot of kids that are rail fans. Back in the day when I was a rail fan, I didn't know anybody that, in my town that was a rail fan. But now that there's social media, it's unbelievable how big the community is. It kind of brought all the community together. And there's a lot of kids that have gotten involved. They're shooting video with if they got an old, maybe their parent gave them an old phone, or maybe they're lucky enough they have a phone. They're shooting video on the phone, they're taking photos. They're able to they could kind of convince their parents, hey, can I get a scanner? It's only $130 or whatever it is. It's not that, it's not terribly ridiculously expensive. So, yeah. But yeah, I mean, this is, the 125 AT is definitely the one that I recommend. When I was at Scanner Master, when it first rolled out, I created a Railfan package for this, which came with a VHF antenna. It came with, a carrying case. I printed a directory, came with an AC and DC adapter, had everything. So basically for the Railfan, had everything. So basically, I promoted a little crap out of this, and we sold hundreds and hundreds of 125 ATs because of this. We'll go to the next slide. So recommended scanners. So any scanner will basically do. And you just need something that'll work on VHF 160, 162 megahertz. It's actually 161, but I put that in there just so you can get a band. Handheld scanners are best. Use trackside. If you're doing something in the car, of course, a base mobile would be best, or in the home. Digital, yeah, you can invest into a digital scanner. Make sure it's NXDN capable. So if you want to future-proof, then you want to probably do something that's NXDN capable, or the scanner that just got announced last Wednesday, which I'm going to show you in a second. So what we have here is, I never offer that scanner, but that's the latest handheld radio that just came out. Doesn't have alpha tagging. This is the something 30. I can't remember what it is because I never go to that one because it doesn't have alpha tagging. The 125 AT has alpha tagging, so you're able to program an alpha tag text and frequency to it. This is the 15X, which is an analog trunking scanner. At this point, that was the closest base mobile you could get, for being able to do the railroads, unless you were going to do a 355N. If you guys are familiar with that radio, it's a small little radio with no keypad, and it's a pain in the butt to program. We'll go to the next slide. So 125 AT, fairly simple radio. It's got a scan button, it's got a hold button, it's got service searches, lockout, backlight power button. Of course, you're able to program it through the keypad. It's got a function button because Uniden's whole claim to fame. It's easy to use because it's got fewer buttons. If you guys have owned Radio Shack or Whistler radios, there's more buttons on there. Their claim to fame is what less function, more actual just straight button press. So Uniden basically less buttons on the keypad, but it's function plus a button for some of those other applications. So of course it's USB. So it takes a USB cable. That cable can also be programmed and powered. On the top, of course, we have a B and C connection. We have a headphone jack and then a scroll and function knob. That knob alone can scroll through the frequencies on the radio. So if you want to just scroll, if you push down and turn, we'll adjust the volume. If you do function and push down and turn, it'll adjust the squelch. So it's a multi-function knob. We'll go to the next slide. Here's the model number, which I never remember. So the Uniden Bearcat, if you were to get this at Scanner Master, it's $129. It's handheld radio, 500 channels, 50 channels per bank. So it's a bank-driven scanner. So it's simple to program, can be programmed through software. It's got alpha tagging. That's what I like about the radio, because you can program in, something and related to the channel as well. Has service searches, that includes rail and air. So if you're an aviation enthusiast, you can use this radio for the same thing. AA rechargeable battery, so it doesn't have a battery pack, and it's USB, AC/DC, and then of course you can use that for programming. Pretty much this radio is the same exact thing, minus the PL tones, no alpha tags, and it's a little bit cheaper. You might as well spend the $10 and get the alpha tag. And I like the 125 AT. We'll go to the next one.
Is the software extra?
Software, Uniden does offer free software, but it doesn't allow you to import in from Radio Reference. So if you're wanting to import in from Radio Reference, then Utel software creates the ARC 125 software, which you can program this radio. Next. BCT15X. So this is an analog trunking scanner, which I typically will go to for someone that's looking for something with alpha tags. Of course, it's got a huge memory, 9,000 channels. Best program with software because it's not a bank-driven scanner. So this radio has got a memory structure that's more geared towards trunking, with the systems and groups and so forth. Has, the PL tone and service searches and a record jack in the rear. So if you've ever listened to any streams on Broadcastify, typically it's something like this. It's got a record jack. The great thing about the record jack is you could send this out to a Broadcastify feed, and it's independent from the volume jack on the radio. So you can adjust the volume. It's not going to affect your feed. So you can kind of use this in your shack to be able to listen. Then when you go to bed, you're using this for a feed. You want to make sure you leave the radio on, but turn the volume down, and that's not going to affect the record jack. We'll go to the next one. Here's the brand new radio. This is just announced. We've been sitting on this for a while, myself and a couple other beta testers. Not the whole beta testing team was on this because we geared this towards a railfan, aviation enthusiasts and such. So Uniden, I don't know if they saw how many 125 ATs I was selling. They decided to make an upgrade to the 125 with basically the BCD 160DN and the Uniden Bearcat BC 260DN, which is the base mobile. So basically what they've done is they've taken the 125 AT and of course made it into a mobile radio, and it's able to support DMR and NXDN, non-trunking. So it's straight, conventional. Next slide. So this radio, when I did the show last Wednesday, some people were like, what the hell is this? It's, I'm not going to be able to listen to the Mark system with this. This is not P25. It's not for me. It's not made for you. It's made for the hobbyist. So essentially somebody that's into aviation or listening to military air or maritime or rail fans or, auto sports such as NASCAR, or somebody that wants to monitor conventional stuff such as CB, ham radio, GMRS, MERS, and what such. So it's more of a hobbyist radio. It's filling basically a niche and offering DMR and NXDN conventional without having to pay for it as an upgrade. So all the other Uniden radios, you buy that digital 996P2 or 325P2, so you get P25. But if you want NXDN, DMR, or Pro Voice, you're going to pay to upgrade it. With this radio, it comes included in the box.
So just out of interest, is there any maritime traffic around here with the?
I haven't, to be honest with you, I haven't tried it, but I believe, yes, along the waterways, you should be
I
able
would
to get.
assume that they're using the same frequencies as maritime allocations, not, yeah.
The barges.
Yeah,
Barges
yeah.
are-
The other thing that you can hear on those frequencies is truckers in the middle of Arizona using that band to communicate to one another because they don't want to use CB radios. They aren't supposed to be using it on land, but occasionally they'll do that. And the other people that will use it illegally is hunters. They'll try using these radios because you can go to like one of these boat stores and purchase the radio right off the shelf. And then, so I used to, when I worked at Scanner Master, I went to a trade show and I ended up talking to one of their, game commission or that department that kind of patrols looking for people poaching and doing that stuff. So he had in his vehicle, he had, of course, his two-way radio, and he also had a scanner, and he was running the service searches. So he's running the service searches, for maritime and other things like CB or GMRS or MERS. So he's running on the scanner, of course, driving the his patrol into various parks and such. And of course, these guys, that would be hunting illegally. One would be the lookout, and then the other guy would be, doing the thing, and they'd be communicating with each other. And then, of course, he knew, oh boy, it looks like the signal's getting stronger because it's no repeater. So of course, as you get closer and closer, he's able to catch these guys. And they'd be yapping away on the radio, and little did they know they were going to get caught. But yeah, I mean, that's one story that I learned. They were using the radios where they don't supposed to be. Next thing. So as I mentioned, it's an analog conventional radio. It's got 10 banks, 100 channels per bank, so 1,000 channels. So it's a little bit bigger than the 125 AT where it's only got 500. Programming, of course, you can program analog communication, which is your regular bands, programmable service search, programmable, PL tone search. Getting ahead of myself. And then of course, digital and NXDN conventional. You can program the RAN and color codes, no upgrade needed, DMR and NXDN included. So basically you're getting DMR and NXDN on a radio that's somewhat low end, not paying, They haven't said the price, but it's not gonna be $400. As far as I know. And there's the radios right here, of course, portable right here, the base mobile there. We'll go to the next slide. This is the first time outside of the show that I've actually been able to talk to about this publicly. They had Unit has me sign back when I was a beta tester, they had me sign a waiver that I'm sworn to secrecy. That I can't talk about any of this stuff. So there's a whole bunch of service searches. Unit actually came up with a better service search layout. So it's a whole bunch of, so of course, public safety, conventional, not trunking, of course, media, ham radio, maritime, railroads, airband, CB, FRS, GMRS, racing, FM broadcast, military air, and then plus you can add in 3 custom service searches. Now, service searches, any of you guys that have used the scanner, so when you do the railroad service search, it just scans through every single section of the frequency band. With this radio, they actually partitioned it out. So it has, each section, and I believe for ham radio, it has, all of your various bands. So you can run the service search on that particular band. So you can go into the service search, it'll have all those on, and then you can turn off certain sections. So if you only want to focus on a certain range of the ham radio frequencies, you can do that with the radio. This is something cool that they actually did with this particular radio.
What's the frequency range of this radio? What can it receive?
So basically, analog conventional is basically from the low band from 25 megahertz all the way up to the 800 and 900 megahertz. I don't know why they put the 800 and 900 megahertz on there because most of it's digital in that range, but they put it on there. There is a spec sheet that I was able to broadcast during the YouTube show last week, which I had to put preliminary on it because, that's not finalized. So you'll be able to see the actual frequency bands listed there. But there is some gaps, minus cellular and what such, the normal stuff that they don't want you monitoring. Next slide. So Butel software. Currently, he's working on Butel software for the new radios. He's actually got a beta radio, which he's working on he's actually over there in the Netherlands, a good friend of mine. He actually sells his software, and of course, Scanner Master is one of the primary places. The great thing with the software, of course, it's a spreadsheet, fairly simple to program. If you're a Radio Reference subscriber, of course, and you're a paid member, you can basically import the information in on any one of his softwares into the software, and then of course edit it, and then of course download it to your radio. There's also another cool thing with the software for the 125 AT. It has a virtual screen. So if you have this plugged up to your computer, you can actually see a virtual screen of the scanner screen. The other great thing is the data logging, which you can see here. So if you're running a service search and you want the scanner to basically find new frequencies, you can run this overnight. It'll show every single time a radio transmitted, what frequency it was, what time it was. And then you can kind of look for new frequencies, essentially. The old back in the day looking, frequency hunting, but you can do it with the software. So Smiley antenna. I'm not too sure if any of you guys heard of this. I had a viewer of the scanner guys and Train Aficionado know how crazy I am about monitoring the railroads. So viewer recommended this antenna, which is the Smiley antenna, which is this here, works phenomenally well on the railroad frequencies. It basically is tuned to 160 megahertz. It's not very expensive, about $24.95. And the great thing about it is you buy the antenna and then you decide what adapter you're looking for. In this case, this radio takes a BNC connection. So I ended up doing one of these. And then I do have an Anytone radio, which has the SMA version. Of course, what I could have done is I could have bought another adapter and essentially swap back and forth in between the two radios, but I used both of these radios at the same time. So I end up, purchasing 2 antennas. Right here, it's a small family-run business right here in the United States. So it's a really nice company, that's based right here in America. And the antennas are not very expensive. And they're all rubber duck style. It's all portable antennas, and they have a different antennas. They have some for aviation. They have some that are wideband, but this one is the one that I use. I talk about these antennas all the time. They don't give me anything. I don't have any. They don't send me samples. I send business their way. I'm sure they're thrilled about it. Next one. So the channels, let's take a look at some of the channels that you can monitor here. We'll go to the next slide. So common channels that you can monitor, of course, you'll see it listed on radio reference as the road channel. So typically that's all the communication that's happening on the road. The train crew is going to stay on this road channel. So, like if the dispatcher needs to get a hold of them or they need to get a hold of the dispatcher, they're going to stay on the road channel. Of course, there's a yard, that's self-explanatory. When they're in the yard doing some switching and what such, they're going to switch to that channel. So the road channel, remember that's primarily where, when they're on that particular, traveling down a route, they're on the road channel. The dispatcher can direct that train to go to the dispatch channel. Now, the reason being, they need to give a train instructions. Do you want to tie up this channel? You don't want to tie up this channel. In case the train goes, and another train that's on the line goes into emergency, they can't get through. So let's say dispatcher has to give extensive instructions to a train crew. So what you'll hear over the radio is say, hey, I got some orders coming over, that I need to give you about some track speed restrictions. I need you to switch over to 22. So you'll hear the dispatcher tell them, they'll switch over to 22, they'll get their instructions. Once they're done, they'll go back to channel 8.
Well, it sounds like our call frequencies. We have call frequencies, you call CQ.
Yep.
And then you move off once you get the communication started.
Yep, exactly. Exact same thing. Some railroads, depending on the line, may only have the road frequency, depending on how, if it's not that busy, they may have one frequency. Here in the Cincinnati area, if you're rail fanning up the road, there's 2 frequencies. There's a road and dispatch. Maintenance away do use frequencies occasionally for crews, to communicate one another. Of course, there's the police have their own frequencies. So the police are pretty much federal, so they can cross over, basically they patrol the little strip of land that the railroad's on, and they're able to go over the line. Like Amtrak police, for instance, they make patrol from Boston all the way to Connecticut, one officer or a couple officers. So they have federal jurisdiction over that property. Hump, occasionally, this is another channel basically for the yard. If there's a hump yard, they're coordinating, basically they're using a hump yard where the
Big
cars.
classification yard.
Yep, exactly. So they're using that for basically sorting out traffic, and that's just another channel. For the most part, when you're rail fanning, the road, dispatch, and yard channels are probably going to be the most important to pay attention to. Next slide. So here's the channels. There's more channels now because of 1, narrow banding, and 2, some of these channels have been allocated for NXDN when they do go to NXDN. So these are typically the 97 channels when they're running analog. So as, for example, the road channel down in Wyoming, that line that goes through there is channel 8. And then the dispatch channel, if I remember correctly, is 66. And then once it gets up to Hamilton at Butler Street, the dispatch channel remains the same, but the road channel remains the same, but the dispatch channel changes. So, you may want to monitor 2 frequencies when you're north of Hamilton if you're rail fanning CSX. And of course, all these frequencies can be found on radio reference. And on my website, trainaficionado.com, I have a rail fanning guide for the Cincinnati area, which I kind of lay out some of the frequencies. But yeah, it's as simple as this, the crew can switch over to any one of these channels. I mean, they could say, hey, I need to do a couple of yard moves on a spur. So the dispatcher, not the dispatcher, but the engineer and the conductor could switch over to a neighboring frequency. Hey, can you go down to 70 while we do this, in this industrial park? So they'll switch over to channel 70, they'll communicate with one another, they'll get off the road channel. And then once they get back onto the road, they'll switch over, of course, to whatever channel that may be. We'll go to the next one. So here's some of the local frequencies. I'm not too sure how up to date this slide is. I mean, I've been fine tuning a little bit more, but you do see, there's certain subs or hubs or districts. For instance, the Cincinnati terminal, basically running from, north of downtown Cincinnati all the way up to Hamilton. Channel 8 is the road channel, 66 is the dispatch. Then once it gets further north, 8 remains, still the road channel, but the dispatch channel is now 12. And then continuing, on any of these other lines, like the Indiana sub, basically from Cincinnati to Washington, Illinois, and not Illinois, Indiana. That's the route that runs along Route 50. They're still on channel 8, but their dispatch channel is 16. And then the Indianapolis sub, which is the spur that run, no, not spur, but the line that basically goes over MLK Boulevard and heads east, west into Indiana. There's their road and dispatch channel. And then, of course, the I&O, which is the Indiana, Ohio, and then, of course, Norfolk Southern channels here. And you can see many of the lines will have typically 2 frequencies programmed. So if you're rail fanning, you may want to scan the 2 channels. Typically, so you'll be able to hear the action in case the dispatcher tells them to switch over to 16 or whatever channel to communicate. Typically, like if you stay on channel 8 for the most part, you're going to be able to hear some road action around you. So if you're just locking in on that one channel, you'll be able to hear some activity. We'll go to the next.
So what happens when the train on the road coming in from Hamilton crosses over Witten Place?
So it's
Is that becomes the yard and it's off the road channel?
so once it goes into there, then there's going to be there's communication into the yard once they get in there. And then once they come out of the yard, they're going to go back on to whatever road channel that's.
So technically Witten Place is the yard limit then?
Yes, so technically, and sometimes if they're just traveling right through, they'll stay right on the road channel.
Okay,
So unless they're doing something where they're coming in and they need to park, then they're gonna switch over to a different frequency and then find out what track do you want us to put our train on, essentially.
so also I don't see any of the Kentucky frequencies. So when they cross the bridge, when they cross the CSX bridge.
So there is frequencies for that. I just haven't,
Okay.
fine-tuned them on this slide.
Okay,
But yes, basically, they'll probably stay on. It's in the districts or subdivisions will go through different states. It depends on, from point A to point B, they're on this frequency and so forth. Like I do have Norfolk Southern's rat hole,
oh, yeah.
which is right there. So basically it's 56 and 9. That's the first district. That's the upper end of the rat hole, basically running from Ludlow down to, I forget how far it goes for the first district. And then after that, be a frequency change there. And if you're on board, like a train such as Amtrak, sometimes the crew will communicate to each other, switching over to channel 16. And then when you're on board the train, you can kind of follow the frequency changes if they say it over the radio. If they don't, you need to kind of do some research and make sure that you're ready to make the frequency change.
I can comment about the Amtrak, especially the Cardinal. You can actually online look up the route in milepost what channels that you'll be operating on. Stays mostly the same, except for like when you get to DC area or stuff like that, cities like that might change. Another thing is oftentimes the crew will see that you have your radio and they will volunteer information. I've had that happen before where this guy gets out the schedule, starts writing down, the channels and saying, between these mileposts we'll be here, on these mileposts we'll be getting train orders on UHF, blah, 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 blah. So sometimes the train crew on Amtrak will be very helpful in helping you out with what channels to be on and when, but not always. Some of the crew don't really. But I had a good experience with the crew while helping me out with my radio.
That's for sure. I mean, it depends on the crew. A lot of the crew members do know that about Railfans, and they'll be extremely helpful.
Yeah, Railfans are very helpful to the railroad for reporting issues and things. So got to keep them happy.
That's for sure. We'll go to the next. Go to the next slide. So what we'll do is just go into your questions and then pretty much wrap this up. Do you guys have any questions? Go ahead.
You mentioned the rat hole. That's a historic name. There was an old tunnel near what's now Lake Cumberland. And when they put the lake in, the old tunnel became unusable. I think the bridge would be too low for what they wanted for the lake.
and now we have a really big bridge there.
Yeah, and
Yeah, but then that they abandoned that old, what they call rat hole, but the name rat hole stuck as a historic name.
Yeah, because there was a lot of tunnels on that line, from what I understand. I'm not an expert at the line, but basically they daylighted some of the tunnels. So now, the trains are not going through those. I mean, keep in mind with tunnels, that's creating height issues. So, like if you see it, some of the inner.
Radio coverage issues.
Yeah, radio coverage issues too, because you're going into the tunnel, and if they haven't repeaterized, with dirty coax and stuff, to a degree to be able to receive in there, that can create an issue. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely the rat hole. It had a whole slew of tunnels. The other thing too, that's the one line that's owned by a city. Basically going from Cincinnati all the way down to Chattanooga. City of Cincinnati owns that and leases that to Norfolk Southern. And then right now, I guess I haven't been following it, but eventually they're gonna sell it to Norfolk Southern. So basically, I think they lease it for like 18 million or some ridiculous amount of money. So the city of Cincinnati gets like $18 million a year just for Norfolk Southern to use it, that income, and they're trying to, Norfolk Southern wants to buy it versus leasing it, so that'll be.
They're looking to discontinue the steam excursion that they have on that line.
As for steam, they have to, in order for them to run steam, they have to have, basically a computer in there for the signaling system now. Like the UP steam locomotive actually has computers in the steam locomotive. If you're familiar with 611, which is a famous steam locomotive, before the PTC, the positive train control signaling system, they could run on the main line. But now they can't run on the main line. They have to do ferry moves where a diesel locomotive's got to basically run in front of them because it has the signaling system.
There's only a handful of steam locomotives now that can do mainline.
Yeah.
There's like 6, I think, total.
Yeah, there's not that many, and they of course have to have the computerized system in there in order to be able to register with the signaling system. Any other questions? I'll go through a couple of these slides real quick.
I'll show you guys pictures later on. So you're talking about the tunnel at Cumberland. You can't really see the tunnel anymore, but I can show you the bridge piers that used to.
Yeah, I figured you probably couldn't. And
I have a cottage down, my in-laws have a cottage down Lake Cumberland, so.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I followed, yeah, I have actually pictures of the US 25 tunnel that's flooded. Because they lowered the dam to do the repairs and lowered the lake level. You can see those tunnels, but the railroad tunnel, you can't see it anymore because there's too many trees in the way, but you can see the approaches where the piers used to be.
It's so crazy, and not only this hobby, for being able to monitor railroad lines, there's so much history with it, with the abandoned railroad lines.
Yeah, look at your website right now.
Yeah, so there's all types of stuff that you can kind of, like if you're a history buff, there's stuff there for that. There's stuff there, if you're a scanner or radio enthusiast, you can monitor the communication. If you're into photography, it's a great, great hobby to photograph various different types of locomotives. Just want to mention, my website's trainaficionado.com if you want to learn more. We actually have a rail fanning event in Saturday morning in Glendale, where I've been doing these trackside meetups where people can come out, rail fan with me, for the morning. So this Saturday from 9 a.m. to noon, we'll be out in Glendale, right in that parking lot, right by the railroad tracks by the police station. We'll sit there, rail fan, for the morning. It's a bunch of guys, of course, from the Cincinnati Railroad Club and anybody else that wants to join. And girls, yes. And girls as well. So of course, on my website, you can see current events, you can see railroad history, product reviews, the store. I have some swag for Train Aficionado. Trackside guides, which I'm working on. I have the Cincinnati Trackside Guide, which I'm currently working on and continuing to work on. I also have, if any of you are familiar with Altoona, Pennsylvania, the Horseshoe Curve, I have a trackside guide that's covering both east and west of the Horseshoe Curve. So there's more spots to go rail fanning other than the Horseshoe Curve. And also, so much more in there. We'll go to the next slide. So as always, as I mentioned, I feel like I'm doing a live show. As always, make sure you follow, like, and subscribe to Train Aficionado on social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. I think that's it. Is there any more slides after that? And there's the frequencies again. All right.
It's
Yeah,
great.
you mentioned that you're an in-scale modeler. I'm also an in-scale modeler. What do you like to model in in-scale?
So I have an N-scale layout, which right now my full-time job kind of takes me away from
I
working.
know what you mean.
Huh?
He said he knows what you mean.
Yeah, so basically the full-time job kind of takes it away. It's a lot easier for me to go rail fanning than, and of course, model trains are very expensive. So
Yes.
if you've got any grandkids or any kids, get them involved in model trains. They won't have any money to do anything crazy because they'll be spending it on the railroad. So it's kind of a good hobby to get them into. And of course, even rail fanning is a great thing to keep some of these kids out of trouble. I mean, it gets them to be able to kind of get outside, be able to spend some time trackside, taking photographs of trains or videos or whatever it may be, or just hanging out outside. And of course, a lot of these kids now are able to network together through social media. So that's the big thing. When I was a kid, there was no, Facebook groups or anything like that. So I figured I was the only weirdo in the town that liked trains, but little did I know there's a whole bunch of us. So definitely, a really cool thing. Train Aficionado show will be tomorrow night, live on Facebook at Train Aficionado on YouTube, and then of course the Scanner Guys show each and every Wednesday night. I'm live and we do have a chat, so you can communicate to me, during the show. I'll try to read as many comments. Allie basically runs as producer, so she's kind of manning everything, making sure everybody's behaving, and also she's putting up some of the questions. So in case I miss it, she's able to see it. But that's it for me. I do have cards if you want a card, from my website, and I also have a couple of flyers. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for.
Thank you. Gary was the one who recommended you, so he was the one who recommended.
Yeah, I mean, I greatly appreciate this. I'm gonna have some events, of course, at the Cincinnati Railroad Club. For my events, you don't have to be a member, so you can come out and come out to our meeting room on the 3rd floor. It does have a pretty decent view of the yard. It's not as good as Tower A, but you can definitely see the yard. And of course, I'm gonna be probably talking about scanners or trains or both. So that wraps it up for me. If you guys don't have any other questions, I'm good.
Great. Thank you.